Just I tell you a little bit about my story. Hopefully you can stay awake for a couple of minutes through it, and it doesn't get too tedious. But it'll help you to know who I am. You'll help me because when I say I'm the district superintendent of the Australian North and West District, that immediately puts me in one space. But if you know who I am, that will help a lot with what we're about to do. It's actually very cool to be in Melbourne this weekend. My dad was born in Melbourne, raised in Melbourne, and became a Christian in Melbourne at the age of 16. He became a Christian through the McKinnon Church, which became the Mount Waverley Church. Last night I couldn't remember. I rang my mum and said, "Where did Dad get saved?" He got saved in the McKinnon Church. So they no longer, but some of you guys would know about that, right? McKinnon Church became the Mount Waverley Church. So that was where he started attending, and you were saying that you had to catch two trains and walk. That's what he did every Sunday morning. Two trains and a tram, or two trams and a train, or something. It would take him 2.5 hours every Sunday to get to worship service. But God did something in his life, and when he became a Christian, his dad threw him out of home, and out in the streets. His dad was a policeman, and a very rough person. And threw him out of home, and he ended up living with the pastor. And God cemented a call in his life, and he went into ministry. He moved to Sydney and met my mum, who was a Queensland cattle farming woman. Her great grandfather, my great grandfather, had immigrated from Scotland and built up a great big cattle station. Their family owned something like 100,000 acres in central Queensland, and so she was born on a property that was 40,000 acres, and so she's a Queenslander, and as all good Queenslanders do, when they get a chance, they make people move from Melbourne to Queensland. So she saved my dad, and sorry folks, you just got to forgive me. But my mum, how many people know the name? And I don't expect you to, but some of you might. Reverend Albert Berg. If that name rings a bell for the guys who've been around for a while, he was my mum's uncle. So when I say I was born into the Church of the Nazarene, for those of you who don't know the name Reverend Albert Berg, he was the very, very first Nazarene in Australia. So people used to say that he carried the Church of the Nazarene around under his hat, but he could boast that on any given Sunday morning he was the only church in Australia that had 100% in attendance, because he was the only one. But it got going very, very quickly. And very, very quickly after he started saying, "This is the church I want to be a part of," he connected somehow with people in Sydney and Melbourne. And within a couple of years, there was these Nazarene churches springing up, being born in this dream of changing the world with love. So that's when I say. So when I come to this context, I come to this context with that kind of background. When I was about 20 years of age, 19, 20, I met a young lady, and we fell in love. I wanted to marry her. I discovered that her life was a very, very messed up life. As we got to know each other more and more, I discovered that she was actually a prostitute and was living a very, very harsh life. But I had fallen in love with her. I wanted to marry her. I started talking to her about Jesus. She'd never heard any of this before. She came to church one time. We were getting closer and closer together, and on one morning I had asked her to go to the beach with me. It was 1982, and we had a couple of conversations about what it meant to become a Christian, and I was planning to take her to the beach that day, introduce her to the gospel thoroughly, see her get saved, and when she prayed the prayer, when she'd finished praying the prayer, I was going to ask her to marry me, and that was the plan. But as we were heading to the beach that day, we had a car accident, and her sister, who was also in the car, and her were killed in that car accident, and my neck was broken in 2 places, and I ended up in hospital, and I was a training police officer, and as a result of that accident, I was kicked out of the police force. And my whole life crumbled around me. And people would come to me in hospital and they would say, "Well, God works everything together for good." And I went, what kind of a God kills people for good? How did he make the choice to kill my girlfriend and let me live. Did he toss a coin? Why was her life more valuable than my life? I didn't feel like it was. And I hated that God. And I got as far away from that God as I possibly could. And I started to medicate my pain in every way that I could think about. One evening, I was lying in my bed, sober for a change, and the Holy Spirit entered my room. In fact, I felt like the presence of Jesus walked into my room. And he stood at the end of the bed, and he said, "Roland, I want you back." And I said, "I can't come back. Look at me." And Jesus said, "I want you back." I said, "I can't." He said the third time, "I want you back." And I said, "Jesus, if you'll do something with my life, if you can make something of my life, I will come back." And Jesus accepted me at that point. As I discovered recently, that was never the transaction. That was my concept. We didn't have a transaction. He loved me in that moment and embraced me and received me because he loved me, not because I let him do something with my life. And that's a huge shift. But I didn't know it at that point. And so I got up from my bed where I prayed. The next day, I went to church. That Sunday morning, I went to the altar and I said, "God, whatever you can do with my life, I will let you do." 2 months later, I was enrolled in Bible college. I met my wife now that first day of college. We dated 1 week later. We're engaged a month after that and married at the end of that year. So I felt like it was God restoring my life. But as I got into ministry, there was this echoing voice in the back of my head. "You're not good enough. You don't do enough. You've got to do more. You've got to try harder. God saved you from that accident. You've got to do more. You've got to be better. You've got to do more." And the first church I pastored started growing. My first Sunday in church, there was 19 people in church. The last Sunday we were there 3 years later, there was 97 people in church. God was at work, but I never felt like I was doing enough. The second church I pastored was a bigger group of people when I got there, and I managed to make it a smaller group, but then we started to grow, and people got saved, and I worked as hard as I possibly could, but that voice was always there. "You're not doing enough. You're not good enough. You need to do more. You're not working hard enough. You need to do more." And so I found myself living in that place, trying harder, and it began to stretch my marriage, stretch my relationship. And I found myself struggling with these words. It didn't matter how many people got saved. It didn't matter how many times people said to me, "That was a great message this morning." It didn't matter how many times I would go and visit people and they would respond and receive Jesus. It never felt like enough. And so one day I opened the mail and there was a book in the mail. It was called "We Are Driven." And the subtitle was the compulsions that America applauds. And I thought, well, who would send me this book? It's about America. And it's all about working hard enough and being good enough and doing all the right thing and succeeding. And everyone's saying, "This is fantastic. You've done a great job because you've done so much." But somebody had seen me, that American spirit. And they said, "You need this book." And this book helped me to recognize that I was a perfectionist. There was something driving me to be a perfectionist. In fact, it had a little quiz in the book. And the quiz, I did the quiz, and I got 19 out of 20. It said if you get any more than 15, then you are a perfectionist and you're in trouble. I got 19 out of 20. And I said to my wife, "I know what my problem is. I'm a perfectionist. I didn't even know I was a perfectionist because I am a terrible procrastinator. How can a procrastinator be a perfectionist?" Well, a procrastinator is a perfectionist because if you can't do it perfectly, you won't do it, right? You'll put it off until some other day. So I was struggling with that, but I said, I did this test and it says 19 out of 20. I am a perfectionist. I know what my problem is now. And my wife said to me, "Well, read me the list." So I read her the list and she said, "Which one didn't you give yourself?" And I said, I don't think I'm that one. She said, "You're that one." So I got 20 out of 20. I am a perfect perfectionist. So I knew what was, and that book introduced me to a concept that I'll share a little bit in a few minutes. And that concept began to break open in my life. And on top of the discovery that love is worth, as I began to allow that to work in my life, I discovered something that changed me forever. But it didn't change me for a long, long time, because I could never escape that. You're not good enough, you're not good enough. We got the opportunity to move to America and start a church in Dallas. And when we got to Dallas, we were given a list of about 90 names. And the district superintendent said to me, there's your future church. There's 90 people. Go and visit them. Invite them to church. Well, I visited almost everybody on the list. What I discovered was those were all people on the list that had left the Church of the Nazarene. And they left the Church of the Nazarene for a reason. They didn't like the people that they were. And so when I would go and say, do you want to come to the Church of the Nazarene? Church of the Nazarene? No way at all. I don't want to. So when I got to the bottom of 90 list, I had absolutely nobody coming to church. And so I struggled and struggled and struggled. And after we'd been there about 6 months, I hadn't gotten very far. I mean, had gotten nowhere. And I began to become increasingly, intensely agitated, because those words kept on saying, you're not doing enough. You're not good enough. This is going to prove you're now in a context where finally people are going to know what a worthless failure you are. This is where it's going to happen. You've kept the illusion up that you can actually be a good pastor because you're growing two churches, but now they're going to find out that you are a worthless failure. And so in that environment, as I began to relate to my wife out of that, we began to argue more and fight more, and she was struggling through her own deep, deep struggle. She had grown up in a home that was unloving, to say the least. And had hurt her deeply and profoundly. And in that environment where I was dealing with the tension and she was dealing with her own personal struggle, she came to me one day and said, I don't want to be married to you anymore. I don't want to be with you anymore. And in that moment, it hit me. All those years before, in a moment, I'd had a car accident. I'd lost my girlfriend, I'd lost my future, I'd lost my job, I'd lost everything that was important to me. It all vanished in a moment. And when my wife stood there and said that to me, I realized it was in the same place. And my world crashed in. Within a couple of days, I was in a mental ward, a psych ward in a Dallas hospital. I'd had a breakdown. And I felt trapped in this room. It was actually a Christian psychological healing program within the contents of a secular hospital, and we would have these group therapy sessions. And I started to talk about the issues in my life. And one night, as I sat, they would put me in a room. They were long, thin rooms. They were probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 meters long and about 2 meters wide, and they'd lock the door behind you when they'd put you to bed. And I was in that room one night, and I was praying, and I was struggling and trying to deal with all of the things that were happening. And in a flash of revelation, I picked up my journal and I wrote, God must be God and love must be enough. I began to realize I can't change the world. I can't fix anybody. I can't control anybody. I have to let God be God. I can't be God. And when I relate to God, I have to relate to Him as God. He's not my magician. He's not my Mr. Fix-It. He's God, the loving God of the created the universe. That's who God is. The only thing that I have is love. And if I can't relate to people out of love that I'd already started to discover, love is value. If I can't relate to people out of that, if I can't relate to my own wife that way, then nothing else is important. If she leaves me because she hasn't experienced love, then I'm the only one that can do anything about that. I have to learn how to love my wife in a way that causes her to feel worth and value regardless of how she relates to me. The only influence I have in people's life is love. As a pastor, the only influence I have is love. If I can't start a church by using love, then any other method would not be right. Love must be enough. And in that moment, my heart changed. God did something deep inside of me that resonated with an encounter I'd had with God many, many years before, where I said, God, I give you every part of my being. And in that moment, he said, do you remember when that happened? This is what that means. In that little group, we were in the hospital, was a young man called Don. Don had been going to work one day a week after his fiancée had left him. And he was shattered and crushed. And on his way to work, he's a builder. He pulled up outside of the building construction site. And as he pulled up, his radio went woo and started searching up and down the radio dial. He hadn't pushed any buttons, he'd done nothing, but it just started scanning. And it stopped. And when it stopped, it said, are you feeling discouraged? Are you feeling abandoned? Are you feeling lost? Then go to this hospital and join this program. We can help you. And he went to that hospital, went to that program, and that's the group that I was in. So we're sitting around this group, and I'm sharing out of my brokenness, sharing out of my lostness, and starting to find healing because I've discovered this truth. God must be God and love must be enough. And he came to me during one of those mornings and he said, you know, when you get your church started, I'm going to be a part of it. And, you know, in a psych ward, that's not the best place to go picking up future members. Because, you know, I went, fine, yeah, that's nice. You know what? We became the best of friends. He is still on the board of that church that eventually got planted. He found a girl through the ministry. They got married. They have a child. I married them, and it was a beautiful story. But I related to Don out of that revelation of love. So immediately that I found that revelation, God gave me an opportunity to live out of that and transformed a life straight away in front of me. So that was when we started really processing. I'd already made this commitment. I'd already understood that love was about worth, but I'd never discovered how deep the pain is and how deep God's love wants to go in transforming us. But in those moments, God showed me the key. And the church got started out of that, and it was a wonderful experience. So what I want to share with you now revolves out of that. So we're going to start with this. The power of your story. You have a story like I have a story. And in the middle of that story, you will find moments of joy and moments of pain. I want to do something not real safe right now. I want us to go and get together in groups of 2 or 3 people. And I want us to share our stories with us, a memory from childhood. I want you to think about a memory from childhood. And I want you to think about a happy memory, and then I want you to think about a troubling memory from your childhood, and just tell the story. So we're going to take about 5 minutes to get into groups. Everybody just get together and tell a story. What was that feeling like for others? Telling our story. When you were telling your story, were you reliving it, or was it like you were reading a book? Reliving it. How many people had that? When you were telling the story, you were seeing yourself there. You weren't. It was actually, you were feeling it. You were feeling the emotions, and that's why I wanted the joy story and the troubling story, just to help you see. You actually felt those emotions, right? When you were listening to the story, did you sense those emotions? It's interesting, isn't it? How many of us enjoyed that experience of sharing those little stories? Once you got into it, I know when I first asked, oh no, I didn't come here to relate to people, I came here to listen. I understand how that works because that's how I feel. But once we were into it and you were telling us, how did that feel? Was that enjoyable? When we give a person a story, we're giving them a part of ourselves, right? We're actually giving away ourselves. We think about our lives in terms of a story. That's how we think about ourselves. We see ourselves in this journey of story. If I hadn't already told you my story before, I would have told you my happiest story when the best fishing trip I ever went on, and my troubling story the day that my family, when we were leaving the US to come home, my family had to leave about 12 months before I was able to leave. So we were facing a difficult period of time, and that was the last Sunday that we were together in Dallas, and those are my 2 youngest kids, and I feel that emotion of those hugs. They knew it was coming. And so we do feel those emotions. Here's an interesting thing. Life is a narrative, and we recall it as such. It's a story. Faith is very often measured in moments, but life is lived as the whole. So we go to church. We have a moment. We get saved. We have a moment. We experience a Bible study. We have a moment. But we live a story and we have moments. Our faith must respond to our story, not just to our moments. And here's the truth that I found. There is something that weaves its way through all of our stories. And when we encounter faith in moments, if it's not weaving through our story, it doesn't deal with the realities that weave through our lives. And so faith becomes this disconnected, conscious process. But our lives are this story, and what has to happen is our faith must become part of our story. It must become part of our reality. It must become part of our narrative. So let's reflect on a couple of things we've already looked at. We all love to love. We love to love. We just love to love. We love it. We love loving. We love loving, don't we? Just love to love. Loving's good. When you're with your kids, that's great. Love your kids. I love being with my kids. I try to make special one-on-one time with all my kids. I love being with my kids. But you know what the coolest thing about being with my kids is? They let me. They let me spend time with them. I mean, these guys, they're just the coolest people on the planet, and they let me be with them. It's just an amazing thing that I get to, and when I'm with them, I'm in my 20s again, because in my brain I still am. But when I'm with them, that's how I feel. Of course, they don't see it that way. They think it's a mission of mercy. But I get to do that. I love that. Don't you love that? We love to love. Being with our kids as parents can be one of the most awesome times. And those times are actually times that we get to sow worth and dignity and value into our kids' lives. So we love to love. We live to love. That's what we live for. We want love. We all want to be loved. We experience love when we experience worth. We live to love. We experience love when we're experiencing worth. If I'm not experiencing worth, I'm not experiencing love. So what happens for us? We love to love. We live for love. We feel worthless. And therefore we're not experiencing love. And we can have this dichotomy. I'm not good enough. Do more. Be a better pastor. Do more. Try harder. Be a part of the doing something people. Love is ultimately a relational term. When I experience worth in relationships, I experience love. So it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Love, it should go without saying, but don't we? So we can talk about love as the people of God as kind of this generic force, but it's about relationship. It's about genuine connection, which again, when you got to tell your stories, by the way, if you had to cut your story off short, did anyone have to do that? How did that feel if I called you back before you got to finish your story? That's frustrating, isn't it? Because you were actually giving part of yourself and it got cut off and you just wanted a chance to finish that story. Sorry about that. When I feel worth less, I experience love less. So let me ask you a question. What is the impact of broken relationship with God upon our lives? So we understand this, don't we? That we, as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, are born out of relationship with God, right? We're not in relationship with God. So theologically, we understand we came into this world and we're born out of relationship with God, and we got saved and now we're in relationship with God. We understand that. But what is the impact? What is the experience? What is the reality of living out a broken relationship, of being in the world outside of relationship with God, being born that way? How does that impact us? Do we experience as a part of our lived story the reality of beginning life in brokenness? Is that a part of our story? Let me ask you this question, and I want some feedback now. What words do you think define the brokenness of our humanity as a result of being born without relationship with God? So give me some words. What is it like? What is it like to live life as a human being in a brokenness in terms of our relationship with God? We've all been there. So what happens for us? What is our reality? Let's see if we can get some words. Disconnected. That's a good word. Disconnected. Give me some other words. No peace. No, exactly. No peace.
Depends how you see God.
It does.
If you believe in God.
Right. That is true. But I'm actually going a little bit deeper than that. So let's just say all of humanity is outside of relationship with God, whether they know about God or not. What happens for a human being because there is no relationship with God? Disconnectedness, no peace. So the human experience, and this is what I'm trying to get at, the human experience of being out, emptiness, right? So the things that we could go up to a person over the street and we could say to them, do you know God? And they would say no, or whatever. And what is life like for you? Well, they'll tell you all the good things. But if you really started to get down, you really started to talk about what's the reality of life, and all of these things are part of that. What else might be there? Hopelessness. Excellent. That's excellent. Can we think of any other words? These are all good. These are the things I want us to really unpack that. Because this is the reality of the human experience. The philosophers would call this the existential reality. It's what it's like to live a life in what is that like? What parts are there? All of those things are there. What else is there? Loneliness. Excellent. Loneliness. Emptiness. Fear. It's a part of that. Worthlessness. Would that be a part of that? Let's just get a little bit vulnerable here. How many here have never experienced worthlessness? Never in your life have you never known a time where you think, oh, I don't amount to anything. None of us. We've all heard those words that were the dominant theme as I tried to be good enough for God. We all know what it's like to feel like I'm worthless. I don't amount to much. And the whole of the world has created mechanisms to deal with that. If we just lived in that space, we would be utterly dysfunctional. We don't. We find ways of coping with that. We find ways of protecting ourselves, of building walls, of making sure that nobody else gets into that space where I struggle with that. But we've all struggled with it. It's the common human theme. And when people are real, that's where they get to. Our human experience born out of relationship with God can be defined by one word. Are you ready for it? Shame. The human experience of brokenness is the experience of shame, and everybody has felt it at some point or another. And what we're going to deal with today is, first of all, unpack our understanding of shame. You know what? Shame is such a part of our human experience, and shame is such a problem for us, we actually don't like to talk about shame. We struggle to talking about shame. In fact, we avoid talking about shame. If someone said to you, come over here and talk to me about your shame. Tell me all the shameful thing that's happened in your life. Tell me how you experience shame. That would not be a conversation you would enjoy being a part of. Because if you think about it and you actually start thinking about the things that have caused you to experience shame, you start to creep away inside, right? We start to pull back. In fact, most of our life, even as Christians, and certainly that was my reality, I never feel good enough. I'm not enough. I am not good enough. That's my struggle with shame. And the good news, if you want to call it that, is we're all in the same place together. Let's unpack that a little bit. Shame exists as a feature of culture, primarily in shame honor cultures. So there's a shame piece in cultures. It is most prevalent in a shame honor culture. Asian cultures, African cultures, I presume probably South American cultures, they recognize the shame honor cultures. And this is what a shame honor culture, this is how a shame honor culture works. If I can contribute to the family unit, I have value. I belong. I fit. I'm accepted. When, as a part of this family, I fit because I bring something to the family. If I do something that detracts from the family or the tribe or the village or whatever, if I detract from that, then I have harder. So shame is much more subtle in a guilt justice culture, but it is equally there, equally prevalent. The second way that shame exists is as an existential personal reality, and we just tried to show that. But we are very, very sensitive to shame. I didn't ask permission. And so even as people of faith, that distortion, what happens is, and neurobiology will tell you this is true, our brain works on short circuits. So when we're learning to drive, right? First time we get into a car, we have no clue, and we've got our feet. If we're doing a manual car, we get all over the place. And we get it wrong. But you do it for a month or so, and it becomes second nature. And before you know it, you're driving, and you're not even thinking about it. And then there's a whole other set of problems. But we can do it automatically. What our brain does is it short circuits everything so that we can do things without having to think about it, right? So our brain has a whole heap of that. The neurobiological pathways make stronger and stronger connections so we don't have to think about it. If I'm born in broken relationship from God, the neurobiological pathways that are developing in my mind are being shaped around the experience of shame. So even when I become a Christian, those pathways are still there. So when the pastor gets up and says, you guys aren't doing good enough. You ought to be at this program, or you ought to be doing that. We go, I probably should be doing that. I should be trying harder. I should be doing more, because the pathways connect very, very quickly. And so we actually learn, whether it be the church or the places we work or the schools we go to, we learn that we can control our environment by using those pathways. If we cause people to feel shame, they will react accordingly and not do things or do things in order to avoid that shame. And when we learn behavioral management through the shame mechanism. So we learn I can control my environment by using shame. But here's the question. If shame is the result of broken relationship from God, shame is the result of sin. When we're using shame, we're actually using the power of sin. And that's why the love way is so radically different, because love refuses to use shame. The power of shame, the great lie, which we just demonstrated right there, the great lie. Shame kicks in straight away. So here's some things to help us unpack our understanding of shame. This part is really, really important. Shame is identity. I am wrong. So my identity, who I am, is wrapped up in shame. I am wrong. I'm the problem. I'm not good enough. I'm the issue. Shame is about identity. Shame is about perception. I am not good enough. My perception is that I am not good enough. Shame is relational. In relationships, my worthlessness will be discovered. I need to withdraw. Shame pushes us away from relationships. Shame always occurs in the context of relationships, and it's always pushing us apart. Shame always pulls us apart. Love always pulls us together. Love is identity. I am his. Shame says, I'm wrong. Love says, I am his. Shame is perception. I'm not good enough. Love says, I love you. You're valuable to me. Shame is relational. It drives relationships apart. Love draws relationships together. By the way, take this little exercise. Go away and think about some of the relationships in your life that have broken. Think back through the process of how that broke. And have a look where shame was in that picture. You'll find it. It was either you struggling with your shame or that person struggling with their shame, but shame will be in there. What if love could have been there in that place? So here's the characteristics of shame. Shame is exposure. I feel exposed. Shame says, you can see me. I'm exposed. The second characteristic is a need to hide. Shame says, I've got to hide away. I've got to get away from whatever it is that's causing me shame. Interestingly experienced, just another example of how much a part of the human race shame is. You've seen this happen. It doesn't happen all the time, but this is an example. You get mum with a little child there. I'm a stranger. I know mum. I don't know the child. They're young. They're small. I come up. I say hi to mum. How you doing? Hello, sweetie. How are you doing? You're a little cutie. What's the child going to do as often as not? Hide away behind mum, right? Just pull back and hide behind mum. Because it's not that I'm exposed. Somebody's looking at me. They can see me. I need to get away. That's why public speaking is such a fear for so many people, because I'm exposed. I don't want to do that. I need to hide. Here's a lot of words. A perceived incongruence between expectations and achievements. What does that mean? Well, I see a gap between what you expect of me and what I can do. That always creates shame. It's the reason that institutions will always create shame, because there's always an expectation and we never feel like we can achieve it. So I go to work, the boss wants X and X and X done. I think I can do X, but I'm not sure about X and X and X. And now I feel bad about myself because I'm not good enough for the environment. And it's a perceived inadequacy. The boss may very well be thinking to himself, anything they do in this job will actually be pretty good. I just need something done. But we're thinking, I can't do it good enough, right? It might actually be the exact opposite. We might think we can actually do it, and the boss thinks we can't, and then they tell us we did a lousy job, and immediately, what do we feel? Shame. Inappropriateness. I don't fit here. I'm not right for this place. I don't belong. This is not my space. That's shame. A threat to trust. Shame says, I'm not sure I can trust you. You are going to hurt me. You are going to expose my own inadequacies, and I cannot trust you. A contempt of self. I am worthless. I deserve to die. I'm not good enough. That's shame. And those characteristics may not be involved in every situation of shame, but some of them will be. And I know that you can already think of times in your life where those have been a reality. So, where does shame come from? The fall, broken relationship. So what was really lost in the fall? So here's a very interesting thing. Prior to the fall, the first couple lived in a state of love that was free from shame. Right? How do I know? Well, how do we know? They were free of shame. How do I know that? Because right at the end of the second chapter of Genesis, it says this. They were naked and they knew no shame. So it was saying, it was saying they were naked and they knew no shame. The evidence that they knew no shame, so the knew no shame is a global sense. They didn't have shame. And the way that we know they didn't have shame is because they were naked. Now, from a Western perspective, we would look at that story and we go, oh, how cute is that? That's nice. They were in love with each other and they're very, very beautiful and they're naked and there's no one else around and that's just a lovely story. So all this is saying is that they were in love and it was a beautiful story. Of course, obviously as the first couple, they could do that. It gets less and less true the further away from that point in time and the older you get, but it still looks like a romantic, lovely story. They're naked, they don't feel it, but that's not what it's saying. Because to the Hebrew reader, in the Hebrew mind, nakedness was shame. If you're naked, then you are shame. So when it says they were naked and knew no shame, the Hebrew reader looked at that and went, what? That's not the world that I know, because if you're naked, there is shame. You see the story of Noah, the 3 sons, and they see him naked. And the Bible paints very clearly that as a shame story. Shame is the narrative of that story where the sons find, the one son finds dad naked, goes away and he tells his brothers come and back into the tent and cover his nakedness because that's a shame situation. He can't be seen naked, so they cover him. You see David coming back from getting the Ark of Covenant and bringing it back to Israel. And he's so overwhelmed with his joy, and he is so ready to say, there is nothing that I wouldn't do to show how much I love my God and am excited about the reality in which I exist, that he stripped naked and danced before the Lord. He is saying, I have no shame in the presence of God. But what happened? His wife saw him, and the Bible said she loved him no more from that moment. She saw him, she knew that's a defile of the shame culture. You are bringing dishonor on our family because you're naked. You're the king and you're naked. That brings dishonor on our family. And the Bible says love stopped from that moment. Do you know where else the scriptures connects nakedness with shame? On the cross. We see paintings of Jesus and he has a loincloth on. But that's not the reality. He was absolutely naked. That whole story, the cross, the nakedness, on a hill, outside of the city, every one of those pieces deliberately is connected in Scripture with shame. To hang on a tree is a curse. Scripture says that. So that's a shamed place. To be on a tree, hung on a tree is a shame. It's a curse. Curse is shame. If you're outside the city, you don't belong. You haven't been accepted. You are in the place of shame. So that's why everyone would bring everybody inside the city at the end of the day, because everyone that came in the city was accepted. They were loved. They were valued. They were honored. But if you live outside the city, then you are in the place of dishonor, of shame. It's very interesting. The story of blind Bartimaeus starts off with, as Jesus went out of the city, he came across a blind man, finds him outside the city in the place of shame and brings healing. Almost every single interaction of Jesus with people is an interaction between grace, honor, and shame. The woman taken in adultery, shame. The woman at the well, shame. Zacchaeus up the tree, shame. All of them, they're all shame stories. And so when it says that Adam and Eve were naked and without shame, it is screaming to the reader, this is the place that we are meant to be. We are meant to live free of shame. This is how God created us to be. So the temptation focused on the disparity between their existence and the existence of God. There's a gap. You are less than God. So that's what Satan says. You're less than God. God doesn't want you to be like him. He's holding something from you. You can't actually trust him. Threat to trust? You can't actually, he's keeping it from you. You can't trust him. And so they try and fix their feeling less themselves. So the devil brings the idea that you are less into the... It's just a thought at this stage. Maybe I am less. But maybe I can fix that myself. I don't have to trust God. I can fix it myself. And sin enters the world. At the moment of sin, relationship was distorted. They hid themselves. So before they were open, before they were naked, now they hide themselves physically and they hide themselves away from God. So it's a very clear juxtaposition in Scripture. Chapter 2, no shame. Chapter 3, shame. And that whole story is about the entrance of shame into the world. It's also about the entrance of guilt, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But the context is now shame. They were shame. This was the reality of their new identity. Go back to what I said before, shame is identity. It's very, very important that we keep that thought in mind. Shame is about identity. It's who I am. The relationship with the Father was distorted. The understanding of themselves was inadequate. So there are three places in the world that we experience, or three types of shame that we experience, and these can get confused together, and then we can miss the point. So the first is emotional shame. It's embarrassment. Embarrassment as an emotion is slightly different to shame as an emotion, but they're in the same, they are self-awareness emotions. So the experience of embarrassment very often goes together with the experience of emotional shame. So there's an emotion of shame. We all have it. We always will. It exists. There's psychological shame. And then there's what I would call theological or ontological shame. It's the shame of being. So we have emotional shame, psychological shame, and theological shame. I'm just going to unpack those briefly for you, and I'm trying to pick up the pace so we can get through this. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. There is an emotion of shame that we might best identify with a sense of embarrassment. That's emotional shame. Even at the level of embarrassment, however, we can still identify the features of shame, the core structure of shame. I failed, therefore I'm embarrassed. I'm inadequate. I am the focus of negative attention. People are looking at me, they see me as negative, in a negative way. So then we get to psychological shame. So the psychological shame is that identity. It's who I am. Shame at the psychological level has the capacity to destabilize or even derail relationships. At this point, it is showing the signs of what they call toxic shame. So shame at a psychological level is the thought life that goes along with the experience of shame. It's all of the psychological features, and everybody deals with genuine psychological shame. As that begins to get more and more and more intense, it leads to broken relationships, it leads to psychosis, it leads to all sorts of psychological problems that come from shame. That kind of shame actually can be dealt with by a psychologist, by counselling, by talking together with friends. Psychological shame can be worked through. The more toxic it gets, the more difficult that process is. And that is because of this reality. Toxic shame leads to deliberate mechanisms, defense mechanisms on the lighter side of the scale, to full-blown phobias and disorders on the more severe end. That's psychological shame. But all of that happens because of this. And as I was doing my research, I kept on coming up to this missing piece. Even Christian psychologists will very readily talk about psychological shame. But it's this piece that's so often missing that is the actual key to understanding it. It's this theological, ontological shame. It's the shame of existence. Because I exist, I am in the shame place. My life is shame. My identity is shame. And the reason that is because of broken relationship with God. So it has to do with God. That shame is about our relationship with God. It's the first shame. It's the primary shame. It's the shame that flows out of broken relationship. So psychologically, shame leads to broken relationship. But as a being, as an entity, I am in shame because of broken relationship with God. It's the pervasive identity of inadequacy. It is the species-wide prevalence of mistrust and a commitment in the first place to creating defense mechanisms, isolating relational barriers, and in and out groups. It's why, as a species, we struggle with shame, because of broken relationship with God. It causes me to create defense mechanisms. It causes me to separate me and my existence from other people. It's what causes us to create in and out groups. So what do I mean by in and out groups? The in groups are the places where we belong, the out groups are everybody else. So you go back to the footy illustration, and the people that belong to my club, which you would guess would be the Brisbane Lions, they're the good people, and the people that belong to, well, Collingwood's okay, but Carlton, you can't go there. so these are my people, and then there's the less people, the inadequate people. We look at that in terms of places that we come from. My city is better than your city. My state is better than your state. My country is better than your country, and even worse, my nation is better than your nation. My national identity is, and so therefore I have the right to destroy you because I'm better than you. Or, even worse, my race is better than your race. My gender is better than your gender. My sexual preference is better than your sexual preference. We find all of these places to create in-groups and out-groups, and then we attach morality to it and we make judgments about them. Now, I want to be careful at that point because I know where people, but the problem is not the issue itself, it's the judgment that goes along with in-groups and out-groups, right? So, my church is better than your church. My faith is better than your non-faith. One of the terrifying things, in truth, about the way we process our faith is that when we look at a non-believer, we see them as inferior. And you accept my faith, it's actually a validation of me. So I want to convince you to become like me and to step into my group so that you will have worth and I too will have worth. And that's an aberration. You are a lousy, rotten sinner going to hell. I'm also a sinner, but I'm going to heaven. But you're worse, and I'm going to heaven. So become a Christian, so you too will go to heaven. What a horrible construct! What a horrible construct! The only reason I'm talking to you is because you're worse than me, and I'm going to heaven, and you're not. And I'll get a better, and I've heard this, you've heard it, I'll get more crowns in heaven because I got you to be in my group. We love because He loved us. People that do not yet have faith are as valuable to God as people that have faith. In fact, I would love for us to stop using definers. I would like for us to be able to see grace, and as Wesleyans, people that follow in the tradition of John Wesley, we believe that grace starts at the moment we are born. And it continues in activity in our lives all through our lives. There is a moment that we embrace that grace. And we believe in response to that grace. But that doesn't make me a better human being. God loved me long before I came to faith, but He loved me so much He wasn't just sitting in heaven waiting for me to come to Him. And He wasn't just doing some action of legal ramifications on the cross. He actually entered my world and loved me actively. From the moment I was born, He engaged in grace in my life and drew me ever continuously to Himself. It's not that we loved Him, it's that He loved us. When He looked at me, He went, "Roland, you're amazing. I love you." And I said, "If you can make something of my life, I'll come to you." And Jesus said, "You know what? I'm just going to let that sit over there because you'll work it out. But the only reason I'm standing here at the end of your bed is I love you. You are valuable to me. I care deeply and more profoundly than you can know about you. I love you." And he drew me to Himself. But that grace had been working in my life for my entire life. And as the church, we have to be careful of allowing in-groups and out-groups to be created because that's a shame structure and it represents our brokenness. It doesn't represent our hope. And our theological, ontological shame brings the fear of the loss of love. We're always terrified that we are not going to be valuable enough to be loved. So the difference between guilt and shame is important to understand. Guilt says, I've done wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. So when Adam and Eve sinned, they had done wrong. And grace was the response to what they had done. But not only did they do wrong, they became wrong. They understood themselves as wrong. The research is showing this, psychological research is showing this. Guilt requires empathy. In order to feel guilt, I have to realize I hurt you, right? If I'm going to say sorry to you, I have to realize I hurt you. So the guilt helps me to understand you're experiencing pain and I'm a part of that pain. So I say sorry and seek forgiveness because of the guilt. So guilt requires empathy. Shame requires self-absorption. I don't care. I don't, this is my stuff. You just have to accept me for who I am. I don't care how you feel this. I've got my rights. And shame is focused in on self. Guilt sees the other person. Guilt is a consequence of love. If it requires empathy, it comes from love. So God speaks into my life, I love you. And the human response to love is, I feel guilt for the brokenness. But shame says you're not good enough. My words to Jesus when I was lying in the bed was, look at me, I'm not good enough. That was shame. I could very easily see my guilt, but it was my shame that tried to resist the grace of God. So some people in the process of doing this say, isn't shame a good thing? Doesn't shame stop us from doing bad stuff to each other? If we feel, doesn't shame have a protective thing? It's an awful thing when someone's shameless. So I want to explain the difference between someone being shameless and someone being shame-free. To be shameless is to create a defense mechanism against my personal shame. So the way I protect myself from the feeling of shame is to say it doesn't matter what I do. It's impervious to any form of challenge. It's a pathological condition. To be shame-free is to discover our identity in Christ, to have our memories healed of their sting, and to be daily being transformed from the habitual psychological patterns of shame. So God calls us to be shame-free, like our original state, not shameless. And we'll get to, I'll unpack in a later session how that happens. It's a lifetime journey. The struggle with shame, we will, because of the patterns, because of the neural biological pathways, we will struggle with shame. But the answer to shame is always the same thing. Always, never any exception. Love. 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 To be shameless is to have no restraint on inflicting pain upon another. Shame is often seen to have positive guiding and controlling impact upon a community, and to be shameless is to live without regard to these restraints. So in that context, people say shame is a good thing, because if I experience my shame, then I won't move outside of the parameters of the community. My response to that, because I honestly do believe the shame is a product of brokenness from God, my response to that is that actually what protects people is love. And we recognize if that experience of shame is me stepping outside of the love. But it's the love that protects me. And if I shame somebody into doing something, they will do it with a sense of their own inadequacy. But when a person does, they can do exactly the same thing in a response to love, and they will do it with joy and hope and enthusiasm. There is nothing that shame can do that love can't do infinitely better. To be shame-free is to be guided by love as our restraint rather than shame. Our identity is intended to be formed we were supposed to know ourselves in our relationship with God, but it isn't formed that way. It's formed in relationship to loss. Its shame is that loss of relationship. Shame becomes me-centered. It's this distorted self that becomes the center of our focus. It's this distorted identity, this shamed identity that becomes the focus of our lives, and that is sin. That brokenness, that separation from God is sin. Our identity without Christ is the sin. So we do acts of sin, but the sin is our identity outside of relationship with Christ. So just because I might be experiencing shame doesn't mean that I've just sinned, that I'm sinning because I have shame. Shame is the result of my brokenness, the brokenness of my relationship with God. So just in case a person feels shame because they have shame, I would want to very quickly say, it's not because I've done sin now that I have shame. If I do sin now, I will have shame. But the shame that I experience from day to day is not a result of the fact that I have done sin. It's a result of the fact that I'm born sin. I'm born in brokenness. I'm born outside of relationship with God. I'm not sure I'm going to spend too much time because we're in this, but the illusion of control. We control in order to feel safe. The reason we want to control is we want to feel safe. We control in order to avoid our fears. We control because all we have to work with is our perspective. I can see things from my perspective and I want you to respond to things the way I want them. I'm going to control this. But remember, we can either love or we can control. The reason we control is because of our struggle with shame. Our perspective is a shame perspective. So love is to release from control, not influence, but control. We will always have influence, particularly if we are loving. It's not to release people from our influence, it's to release people from our control. Love, I love this little piece. Let's see. Okay. Love moves to deeper relationship. Love frees and heals from shame. Let me explain that. Probably doesn't need much explanation. You already understand, right? When I love somebody, so I met Patty today. Instantly, I felt Patty's spirit and I felt love, right? If we had the geographical opportunity, I would love to get to know you better. I would love to move into deeper relationship with you. That's love, see? Love always says, let's become closer. Let's experience more love. Love always moves towards more love. It always does. It's shame that stops love from moving closer. So love says, let's become friends. Let's share our lives together. That's what love does. So love moves progressively towards more love. But in that journey, it transforms. Love always does. So if I'm in a relationship with somebody and I have a friendship with them, as I'm getting closer and closer to them, I'm becoming a better person. Because I'm learning how to love that person more effectively. I'm learning how to get closer to them. I'm learning what they need. I'm learning to be selfless. And I'm becoming actually more like Christ just as a result of that relationship, even without knowing God. When people love each other and they move towards more love and they're changed in that process of love, we believe that's actually God at work long before they even know Him. So love moves towards more love, and in the process, it makes us more like love. It makes us more like Christ. So the discipleship journey is simply a journey of experiencing more and more love, and in the process of from love to love, I become more like love. So love is the answer. Love is what heals us from shame every time. So my shame sets up and says, I'm worthless, don't love me. But as we love, the walls go down, unless hurt comes in. Walls go down, we become more loving, we become more gracious. Doesn't that sound like God? Doesn't that sound like grace? Doesn't that sound like the way it should be? Love frees and heals from shame. When God in Christ makes us holy, He is making us like Himself. God is love. So we're a holiness church. We're a Wesleyan holiness church. We value the human experience of holiness. We believe, all church traditions believe in holiness. So it's not just ours. But we believe the mark of holiness is a transformed life. Not my duty, not what I am trying to do, although we've expressed it that way many times. Holiness is actually me becoming like Christ, not in what I do, but in the being that I am. And what I do flows out of the being that I am. So when God makes us holy, He is making us like Himself. And He is love. So when He is making us holy, He is making us more love. He's taking us on the journey from love to love and transforming us in love along the journey. God is making our story His story. He is healing us from shame in our story. The problem is, most of us remain unaware of the power of shame in our life, so we don't know where to let grace work. We throw defense mechanisms up against the very thing that God is trying to do. God is trying to take us from love to love, and on the journey, make us more like love. But on that journey, in my story, I bump into these things that tell me I'm not good enough. I can't go any further. That's as far as I get. This is the point I need to put my mask on. This is the point I need to have people think I'm good enough when I know I'm actually not. But we believe that as we allow God's love to work in our life, He is always taking us closer and closer to Himself, making us more and more like Him. And there's a theological word for that, which we'll get to in the next session. But that's the journey. That's the process. And it's the heart of who we are. It's the heart of our theology. It's who we are. And we're on this journey together. And there's hardly any more important fact than that we're on this journey together. We are called to love each other. And we'll unpack that a little bit as well after lunch.